Welcome to the OK Let's Learn podcast. This is two podcasts in one where we dive into tons of interesting topics, and another where we just dive into tons of family-friendly books and stories. My name is Kevin O'Keefe. So today, let's learn all about the United States Declaration of Independence. Yes, the last in the trilogy of major influential documents at the beginning of our United States of America. We touched on, I did a whole episode on the U.S. Bill of Rights. We did an episode on the U.S. Constitution. And now, the first one, our Declaration of Independence. When the battles of Lexington and Concord, yes, we have a previous episode on that as well, when they happened in April 1775, we were just angry at the crown, at our king. We weren't considering then becoming a new country. We were not considering being independent. We were just angry, and we wanted things to work out with King George. The goal wasn't, like I said, a new country. It was getting our rights back as British citizens. In fact, right after Lexington and Concord, the Continental Congress sent one more appeal to the king. We called it the Olive Branch Petition. It basically was, hey, can we please stop fighting? We want to remain your loyal subjects, but we have all these grievances. King George didn't even consider it. Instead, he declared that the colonies were in open rebellion. At that point, there was no turning back. So we needed some type of philosophy, some type of understanding that we could send to the king. Ultimately, when we considered independence, it wasn't about creating a new political philosophy. It was already out there. Thomas Jefferson admitted as much. He drew on so many different documents that had gone back hundreds and even thousands of years. Here were a few, and no doubt worthy of a future episode. The Magna Carta in 1215. This basically said that the English king wasn't above the law. Government had limits. Then there was the English Bill of Rights in 1689. It protected, obviously, certain rights of English citizens, and it limited the power of the monarchy. John Locke, he was really influential with Thomas Jefferson and what he put into the Declaration of Independence. He argued that people possess natural rights simply because they're human. He literally was the one that identified these rights as life, liberty, and property. And Jefferson obviously famously changed property to the pursuit of happiness. Why? A lot of historians debate this, and it's still interesting when you think about it, right? Is that really what we want out of life, most people? No, it's not about things. It's about happiness. So Montesquieu, he was another influential philosopher. He wanted or suggested that government existed only because people allow it to exist. Makes sense, right? Power should never become concentrated in just one person or a few people. And then, yes, there was the Age of Enlightenment. Across Europe, philosophers increasingly questioned this idea about why it is that kings have this quote-unquote divine right. Instead, governments should receive authority from the people themselves. This was radical, but it came at around the same time. It was an idea, it was an age that was right smack in the middle of the 1700s, and no doubt this influenced us becoming a country. But the biggest, by far, one document that happened just prior to the Declaration of Independence, it was Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine. It was published just 6 months earlier in January 1776. It sold 120,000 copies in just a few months. Amazing for a population of only, 2.5 million at the time? He argued something that now seems obvious. Why should an island rule an entire continent? His pamphlet dramatically shifted public opinion towards independence. Now there was more and more talk about us moving away from England. So who was the first one to actively come out and say, we need to be independent? We need to make a full shift away from the crown? It wasn't Thomas Jefferson. It came from Richard Henry Lee on June 7th, 1776. He had a famous resolution, and it said, quote, "These united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states," unquote. The Continental Congress agreed that this was an unbelievable, unprecedented decision, and they postponed the final vote while preparing an explanation, right? What was that explanation? Yeah, it was the Declaration of Independence. So Congress, again, we talk about the Continental Congress, appointed 5 men. This forever became the Committee of 5. Who were they? Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. Why was it Jefferson that wrote the Declaration of Independence? He was only 33 years old. Why wasn't John Adams chosen? Well, as he himself later explained it, he said that Jefferson should write it because he was considered the better writer. He was from Virginia, which was the largest colony, and Adams believed Jefferson writing was just smoother, more eloquent. He was able to get his ideas down on paper better than he was. He just said it. He said he could write 10 times better than I could. Jefferson, he wasn't that happy. He tried convincing John Adams to do it instead, but Adams refused. So Thomas Jefferson rented rooms in Philadelphia. He worked mostly alone, and he put together the first draft in about 17 days, roughly from June 11th through June 28th, 1776. So like we mentioned, he drew on the writings of John Locke, the earlier colonial declarations. Yes, the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which was really key. That was written by George Mason. And yes, his own experience. Contrary to popular belief, no, it wasn't one long night of writing. It was over this entire time period, days, and it was definitely revised lots and lots of different times. He actually wrote it on this small, portable writing desk. It's still around, that little writing desk. It's in the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., and what's interesting about this desk, he kept it for 50 years before giving it to his granddaughter's husband, Joseph Coolidge, as a wedding gift in 1825. The Coolidge family eventually donated it to the United States government in 1880. But talk about a myth. We were reading this book in our book club this summer, and it was said that his desk came from the Pine Barrens down in New Jersey, the wood, the original wood. But no, it did not. And it's funny because I just hung on to that, well, just because it was in the book. But no, you got to do your research. He actually designed the desk himself, and he commissioned Benjamin Randolph, who was a really well-known cabinet maker in Philadelphia, to build it when he actually arrived in the city in 1776. But enough of the desk. When Thomas Jefferson finished his draft, he sent it to Benjamin Franklin and John Adams. Franklin made one of history's most famous edits. Thomas Jefferson had originally wrote, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." Franklin changed it to, "We hold these truths to be sacred and self-evident." Many historians think that those 2 words made the sentence stronger. No doubt, I agree. Congress changed it. It wasn't finished. Delegates debated the document for 2 days. They made up to 90 different corrections, deleting about 1/4 of his original draft. Jefferson wasn't happy. He later admitted he hated seeing the words changed. One of the biggest deletions criticized Britain's role in the slave trade. Think about it, right? It's just absolutely amazing. Why was this deleted? Well, of course, Southern delegates objected. The passage disappeared. Now, what about July 4th? Where is that coming from? Well, believe it or not, there was another surprise. America actually voted for the independence on July 2nd. John Adams believed Americans would forever celebrate July 2nd as our Independence Day. Instead, Congress approved the final wording on July 4th, and that became the official day. The actual day that it was signed, another myth. Everyone believes that all 56 delegates signed on July 4th. Nope. Most of the signatures were added on August 2nd, 1776. And some delegates didn't even sign it then. They signed it even later. But again, I mentioned that in our famous moments in August, a previous episode. The biggest signature on the Declaration of Independence, right smack in the middle, by far, John Hancock. And historians again debate this. There was this myth that he made it big because he wanted King George to see it without his reading glasses. It's probably not true, but we really don't know even still today. But the bottom line, it is real. And when people say, give me your signature, a lot of times they'll say, give me your John Hancock. Because not only was it big, it was this impeccably distinguished, great signature. So Congress immediately that night put it out for this document to be printed, and it was known as the Dunlap Broadside. Why? What is that? Have you ever heard of that? Oh yeah, our Declaration of Independence is a Dunlap Broadside. Well, back then, a broadside was basically a large poster or like a flyer. And Dunlap, well, that was John Dunlap, and he was a 29-year-old Irish immigrant, and he was the official printer there in Philadelphia for the Continental Congress. So on that afternoon of July 4th, they rushed this handwritten manuscript to Dunlap's shop. He and his apprentices spent the entire night setting the type, correcting errors, and then ran off the sheets. The next morning, July 5th, there was 200 copies that were ready. Horseback riders immediately carried them throughout the 13 colonies to inform the public, to inform the military and the state assemblies that America, yes, was breaking away from Great Britain. And just remember, this original Dunlap broadside, it didn't have signatures, only the names of John Hancock, who was the president of the Continental Congress, and Charles Thompson, who was the secretary. Only their names are printed at the bottom. So what's interesting is it's so incredibly rare. Since they were intended to be just temporary news posters, they were mostly thrown away or destroyed. Of the original 200, only 26 known copies exist still today. Talk about something that's valuable. There's some amazing stories here. The last one, the 26, was just discovered unexpectedly in 2009 by an American researcher sorting through some colonial-era mail. But listen to this. The 25th copy, it was found in 1989 by a man who was browsing a flea market in Adamstown, Pennsylvania. He bought the dingy old frame painting for just $4 because he liked the frame. When he pulled apart the frame to remove the canvas, there was this little folded piece of paper that fell out, and it was an original crisp Dunlap broadside. In 1991, the document was sold at Sotheby's auction for almost $2.5 million. It was sold again in 2000 for $8 million to the television producer Norman Lear, who made that great comedy All in the Family. He sent it out for a tour of the public for almost 3 years. And believe it or not, today, as of the recording of this episode, 2026, we don't know who has it. It's a private collector who ended up buying it from Lear. And Lear actually came out and speculated that Bill Gates may have it. But hey, that's just speculation. But just know that all those other 24 different copies are all over the country in different locations. So remember, this is not the official one with all the signatures, but this is the one that went out, 200 copies out there to the public throughout the colonies. And yeah, it eventually made its way to King George. And historians don't necessarily believe, and there's nothing been reported that it was one day, one moment, and this was the person that walked in and handed it to King George. No doubt this happened. But the bottom line is nothing ended up coming back to us in terms of literally that moment. He got it. It was hand-delivered to the king, and then the British officials viewed it certainly as an act of rebellion and not really a document that was used to negotiate. So let's talk about what is in the Declaration of Independence. It has four major parts. First, the introduction. It explains why nations sometimes separate. Two, the preamble. It's perhaps the most famous paragraph in American history. It announces several revolutionary ideas. And yes, they were revolutionary. All men are created equal and they possess natural rights. But just think about it, what that just said. Should have said all people, but no, it didn't. So right from the beginning, we had issues with the history of our country, with so many people in our society being marginalized. But as I mentioned with our Constitution, it certainly was not a perfect document. But over the years, yes, it evolved and it changed. But this one, it's right there. It hasn't been changed. And it was just basically saying, and the reason it was considered revolutionary, it's that no king, no one person really is divinely created to be able to rule, right? That no, everyone as they're born are inherently equal. And that's what was revolutionary for the time. And some of the other ideas right here in the preamble, that governments receive power from the consent of the governed, and that if government becomes destructive, people may replace it. These ideas, like I said, were not part of anywhere around the world at this time. And it certainly influenced all the democratic movements around the world going forward. That's why it was so iconic, so amazing, and so influential. Here it is, verbatim. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute a new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Okay, the third part of the actual Declaration of Independence was the grievances. This is by far the longest section. He actually lists 27 complaints against King George III. Among them were that taxation without meaningful colonial representation was wrong, dissolving colonial legislatures was wrong, maintaining standing armies during peacetime, wrong, interfering with colonial governments, denying jury trials, quartering troops, restricting trade, and ignoring colonial petitions, all wrong. They were the complaints. It was intended as evidence before the world as to why we were breaking apart from the king and why it was justified. The fourth part was the ending, the conclusions. The colonies officially declared themselves, quote, free and independent states, unquote, no provinces, no territories, just an independent country. So what did the Declaration of Independence do really well, like I referenced before? It established the principle that governments exist to serve people, not the other way around. It declared that legitimate governments derive their authority from the governed. And it gave Americans a shared explanation for why they were risking everything. And there's no doubt that there was no political document that inspired more freedom movements than this piece of paper. Because ultimately, as it set out right from the beginning by saying all men are created equal, it inspired abolitionists. It inspired the women's suffrage movement. It inspired civil rights leaders. And it was foundational to say, you know what? You got it wrong. Because it's saying up front that all men are created equal while slavery still existed in many colonies? Come on. Women were not granted political rights. Native Americans, they were pretty much excluded from this vision. The document also did not establish any government. It created no president. It didn't set up any Congress or Supreme Court, right? That was the job later for the Constitution. And up first, the Articles of Confederation. But as we know, over 2.5 centuries later, throughout the years, we would all go back to those words in the Declaration of Independence to argue that, that we should more completely fulfill our own promises. To wrap up the podcast, how about some fun facts? Obviously, as you know, Jefferson became our third president. John Adams was our second president. They both died on the same day, July 4th, 1826, exactly 50 years after the Declaration of Independence was adopted. The original handwritten declaration is displayed today in the National Archives building in Washington, D.C., right next to the original Constitution and right next to the original Bill of Rights. You can see them in this grand room. It's called the Rotunda for the Charters of Freedom. All three of them are right next to each other, and they're in this specially designed, bulletproof, gold-plated titanium display case. And inside there's this argon gas to prevent it from decaying. And every night they're mechanically lowered into a bomb-proof, fireproof vault deep beneath the building to make sure that they're safe. When you go, just understand the original ink on the Declaration of Independence has badly faded, obviously over the centuries, because of exposure to light, and it was rolled up, right? So you need to lean in close to see the signatures, including John Hancock's. And purposely the rotunda inside is purposely dark with very low lighting to preserve the fact that this parchment that everything is written on is further damaged. It's just really amazing. You have to experience it. So this piece of paper, it didn't create the United States government. It didn't guarantee every American equal rights. Those rights, those achievements, they would come later. But on that day, on July 4th, 1776, it did something just as important. It announced to the world that, yes, this new nation believed governments existed to protect the rights of their people. And then when they fail, these governments, people have the right to build something better. And here we are, this podcast episode going out in the beginning of August 2026, 250 years and 1 month later. These words in the Declaration of Independence, they continue to shape not only us, the United States of America, but freedoms around the globe, and the idea that self-government needs to be the reality. And speaking of words, hey, On the back end, I realized I made a mistake. Earlier in the podcast, Benjamin Franklin corrected one sentence of Thomas Jefferson's. He had said, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." No, he didn't keep sacred. It was too much of a religious bent to the word. So he replaced it with completely. Both of those words, sacred and undeniable, being gone, and he just said self-evident. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Friends, thanks for taking this journey, learning all about the Declaration of Independence. Reach out to me at kevmok21@gmail.com. We are on Facebook. We are on X. We are on YouTube. We are on Spotify, iHeartRadio, so many different podcast platforms. Just search in Google, "OK, Let's Learn Podcasts," and you'll be able to get it. It doesn't have to be an Apple iPhone. It could be an Android. It could be on your desktop. So until next time, have fun and keep learning.